Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving straight into the surprisingly radical, messy roots of a word you use all the time, a concept that completely shapes our modern world, democracy. But as we're about to see, the way this ancient system actually operated was dramatically different from anything we're used to today. Picture this for a second. What if, instead of voting for a politician to represent you, you and about 5,999 of your neighbors had to drop whatever you were doing, gather in a massive crowd on a rocky hill, and personally vote on whether or not your city should go to war today? No politicians making the call, no representatives to pass the buck to. That was the intense, everyday reality of ancient Athens. Section 1. The birth of people power. So the word itself first pops up around the 5th century BC, and it literally translates to people power. It's a combination of demos, meaning people, and kratos, meaning power or force. What's really fascinating here is that before this term took off, the Athenians used a slightly older concept called isonomia, which essentially meant equality of political rights. But demokratia, that was something way bolder. It wasn't just about equality anymore. It was about the raw force of the people actually ruling. Now, you really have to look at the stark contrast between our modern setups and theirs. Today, we rely so heavily on elected representatives and these complex checks and balances, right? They're specifically designed to cool down mob mentality and stop rush decisions. But Athenian democracy was the complete opposite. It was all about direct participation and absolute majority rule. They even heavily relied on something called sortition, which literally means picking government officials by a random lottery. Section 2. Who were the people? But before we get completely romantic about this ancient idea of people power, we have to address a massive, uncomfortable question. Who exactly were the people? Well, only adult, free, male citizens who had finished their military training were even allowed to vote. That tiny group, which fluctuated between just 10 to 20% of the total inhabitants, held absolutely all of the power. That means this so-called democracy actually excluded an astounding 80 to 90% of the people living in Athens. Let's break down that excluded majority for a second. Women were entirely barred from public speech and basically confined to the private sphere. Then you have the enslaved population. One ancient orator estimated there were around 150,000 slaves in the region. And finally, the metex, or the resident foreigners. Now, the Athenian men rationalized this severe exclusion through some pretty steep prejudices. They claimed women were intellectually unsuited for public life, and they were terrified that giving them freedom would mess up strict property and inheritance lines. Meanwhile, slaves and foreigners simply had no ethnic national claim to citizenship rights. Citizenship was a highly exclusive club, and you had to be born into it. Section 3. Engines of the state. Okay, so how did this actually work in practice? The state was driven by two main engines. First, the ecclesia, or the assembly. Any eligible citizen could literally just walk into this massive gathering to debate and vote directly on policy, usually just by a simple show of hands. But to keep that absolute chaos somewhat organized, they had the boule. This was a council of 500 citizens. But remember sortition. They weren't elected, they were chosen randomly by lottery. The boule's job was to run the day-to-day affairs and draft the actual agenda that the assembly would vote on. Now, here's a number that is just going to blow your mind. 6,000. For major votes, like granting citizenship to an outsider, the assembly needed a staggering quorum of 6,000 citizens physically present in the same place. Imagine trying to get 6,000 of your neighbors to show up to a meeting today. To make sure they actually hit this number, public slaves would sweep through the marketplace, holding a rope stained with wet red paint, literally herding citizens toward the meeting place. If you tried to dodge the meeting and got red paint on your clothes, you were fined. And their judicial system, the dicasteria, was just as chaotic and fascinating. It relied on massive citizen juries, anywhere from 200 up to sometimes all 6,000 jurors for a single case. There were no professional judges to instruct the jury and no professional lawyers. You just had to stand up and speak for yourself. To keep things moving, speeches were strictly timed by water clocks, called clepsydras. Once the water ran out, you were done talking, and the massive jury voted immediately without any deliberation whatsoever. Justice was incredibly rapid, finishing up by sundown. To protect this incredibly fragile, wildly direct system from rising dictators, the Athenians used a totally unique feature called ostracism. Once a year, the assembly could hold a vote. If someone was getting a little too powerful or a bit too arrogant, the citizens could literally vote to banish that politician from the city for an entire decade. It wasn't really a criminal punishment, it was more like a massive preventative timeout to safeguard the democracy from tyranny. Section 4. The Citizen Initiator. Because they didn't have massive government agencies or district attorneys running things, the entire system relied on the concept of hoboulomenos, which translates to anyone who wishes. Any citizen had the right to step up, speak out in the assembly, propose a new law, or initiate a public lawsuit. It was basically the ultimate crowdsourced government. But stepping into that democratic limelight was a really high-stakes gamble. This was not a risk-free environment. If you acted as hoboulomenos and proposed a law, and the assembly passed it, but it later turned out to be a total disaster or was deemed unconstitutional by the courts, you, the person who proposed it, could be personally punished. You could literally be dragged into court by another citizen and penalized for misleading the people. It absolutely forced citizens to be extremely careful and highly informed about what they were actually putting on the table. Section 5. Rise, Fall, and Legacy. When you trace this evolution, it's clear the system wasn't built in a day. It kicked off around 594 BC, when a leader named Solon created property classes, which allowed more free citizens into the political fold just to ease some heavy social tensions. Then, in 508 BC, Cleisthenes took it even further by breaking the power of the noble families and reorganizing the citizens into 10 new tribes based on geography rather than wealth. By 462 BC, Ephialtes shifted massive amounts of power away from the aristocratic councils directly into the hands of those citizen courts. The system just kept growing increasingly radical until it was repeatedly interrupted by oligarchic coups during wartime and was finally permanently dismantled by the conquering Macedonian army in 322 BC. Despite its eventual fall at the hands of an empire, and its glaring, massive exclusions of women, slaves, and foreigners, the Athenian ideal demanded an incredibly intense level of civic engagement from its voters. This culture is perfectly captured by this famous quote from the democratic leader Pericles. To the Athenians, participating in the state wasn't just a casual right, it was the fundamental, absolute duty of your existence. So, looking back at the intense, exhausting, and incredibly direct power of the ancient Athenians, it leaves us with a pretty provocative question. We don't have to dodge red-painted ropes today, and we certainly don't face exile if a law we suggest fails, but knowing what it actually took to run the very first democracy, what do you owe to your own democracy today? Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep asking the big questions.